I think we need to rethink high school and kind of go back and have a much higher expectation of what high school students are capable of in terms of growing up and operating in the adult world to some degree.
Hello, and welcome to the Arts of Language podcast with Andrew Pudewa, founder of the Institute for Excellence in Writing, or as many like to say, IEW. My name is Julie Walker, and I'm honored to serve Andrew and IEW as the Chief Marketing Officer. Our goal is to equip teachers and teaching parents with methods and materials which will aid them in training their students to become confident and competent communicators and thinkers. Podcast episode 385, part 2. We've never done this before, Andrew.
Well, we've had continuing podcasts,
yes,
but we haven't actually had the same number twice.
Right.
And that might confuse people, especially if they're counting the weeks of their life by our podcast.
Well, and we've decided to release both part 1 and part 2 on the same day, which is another first for us.
Right. And this one might be shorter than usual.
Okay.
But you never know.
Well, we do want to be respectful to you, listener. We figure your walk is about 30 minutes. It takes about 30 minutes to clean the kitchen while you're listening to this. So here you go. Part 2 of Hacking High School, which is part of our Homeschool 101 series. Now, we've already addressed 4 different ways that you can hack high school. The first you mentioned was speech and debate competition,
right,
specifically.
Or mock trial or speech contests of some sort. That kind of all falls in the same category, though we didn't talk much about mock trial, but
right.
I think you get some of the same benefits.
Right. And then you talked about doing logic and that you actually taught logic for 4 years to a group of high school students. That's incredible.
Well, it was a sequence that was laid out kind of for me. I didn't figure out what to do. And, if I did it again, I might use different materials.
Sure.
But I did learn a lot from the process of teaching traditional logic 1, traditional logic 2, which got pretty dry, material logic, which had a lot of challenge, and then really just slogging through Aristotle's rhetoric.
Oh, boy.
With a help, with a workbook, guidebook, and teacher's notes and all that. I think if I did it again, I would do it better and probably a little different. Can I tell you one of the funniest things that I learned in Aristotle?
Absolutely.
So Aristotle talks about the forms of government.
Okay.
And points out that the highest and best, most efficient form of government you could have is a benevolent monarchy.
Oh, okay.
Right? Plato's philosopher king. This idea that if you had a truly good person who could be a dictator, it would be the best government you could have. And, we see some examples of that in history, like Cincinnatus, who was a humble little farmer. He had been a senator, a politician, or whatever, and they came to him and said, please come and save Rome. We're in desperate straits. And he said, yeah, I'll do that, but I have to have absolute power over everything and everyone. You got it. So Cincinnatus comes out of farming retirement, takes over the Roman Republic, has absolute power, defeats the enemies, and then does the most remarkable thing in history, abdicates, turns back over power, and goes back to farming.
Oh, wow.
And this is why George Washington is referred to as the modern Cincinnatus. In fact, there are statues of George Washington, kind of his body and face in a ancient Roman costume.
Nice.
Because making that connection. So that nobility. But Aristotle said you can't really have that because, power corrupts. So the next best form of government would be probably an oligarchy,
right?
Where you have a few people with shared power, and those few people can keep each other kind of checks and balances type of thing. And our form of government with the executive, judicial, and legislative branch is in part based on that political philosophy of the division of powers for the benefit of the country as a whole.
Mm-hmm.
And then he talks about democracy. And here's the really funny thing. His definition of democracy is very different than what you or I may think democracy means.
Sure. Isn't that where everybody gets a vote? Democracy.
Yeah. Rule by majority rule.
Mm-hmm.
Or in a republic, you elect officials who then have a majority rule.
Mm-hmm.
No. His concept of democracy is that you would choose by lot at random from a pool of qualified people, those to rule over you for a limited period of time.
Oh, interesting.
And I will confess, I was teaching this right when the most unpleasant election had happened. It was happening, where I really did not want to vote for either of the candidates. And I thought to myself, I would almost choose at random someone from the Tulsa phone book, if there were phone books anymore, than these two people I don't like.
I see.
So it was kind of funny, but that idea of, everyone should be qualified. They should be educated and have the leadership skills to serve for a limited period of time in a position of authority. And that was kind of the early American ideal as well, was that, and Jefferson's desire to have a highly educated population so that everyone would be qualified for leadership capacity in some aspect of civic life. And then, of course, the worst form of democracy is a despot. And that's where you have a non-good monarch, a dictatorship that is solely based on the acquisition of power and control.
Right.
So I just thought that was so funny about this concept of democracy being random among qualified people.
Yes.
And I don't know, there's something I still like about that idea. It's not practical in any sense, but anyway. So yeah, I did teach that. We also talked about, what else did we talk about?
Well, theater and performance.
Oh, right. Drama and theater.
Yep.
And then the thing I tend to get long-winded about.
Which is why this is a part 2.
Yeah, is the dual enrollment, dual credit idea of doing college while you're still the high school age.
Yeah, not a new idea, but becoming increasingly popular.
And there are a lot of good links in our show notes from that. I was going to say last episode, but I guess I have to say the first half of this episode.
Exactly. Yep.
Okay, so there's a few more things I think are worth bringing up for contemplation. One of them is for high schoolers to have an opportunity to teach younger children.
I love that.
And, we all know this. The best way to learn something is
by teaching.
Yeah.
And Andrew, you actually perfectly articulated that when you talked about how you taught logic and how much you learned. Isn't that exactly right?
Yes. In fact, over my history of homeschooling my children and teaching classes to them and other people's children, I have often chosen to teach something because I wanted to learn it better.
Nice.
I said one year, we're going to do economics. Well, I have never taken a class in economics. I have read very few books about economics, but I wanted an excuse. And I knew what books that I wanted to use with these kids. And it was fantastic. But, I was learning along with them.
Yep.
And, this is one thing that, I believe many homeschool parents may have a strong belief or just a subconscious fear that they can't teach something they don't know well. They can't teach something they don't have formal training or formal education. And it's just not true. You can stay 3 steps ahead and learn right along with kids. And in a way, it's almost better because there's a humility, there's an effort you have to put out. If you teach something you know really well, okay, that's good. You know it really well. You feel like you're doing a great job. But I feel like you get this kind of energy and excitement about learning along with the students.
Yep.
So I have, in many cases, in many circumstances, tried to facilitate opportunities for older teenagers who are still, in high school, so to speak, to teach classes to younger children.
Mm-hmm.
And one thing I would point out is, you can teach anything. It doesn't have to be one of the subjects that would appear on a report card, say, or on a transcript.
Sure.
You can teach anything that you love. I have kind of focused on this idea of helping older kids teach writing to younger kids.
Of course.
And part of that is because if they've done a writing program for 3, 4, 5 years, they know it pretty well. I mean, they've got the checklist memorized. They know the rules. They could draw it from memory, probably every one of the model charts from the 9 units.
Mm-hmm.
They have wrestled with it and understood it really pretty well. And so now go on the other side of that and start teaching kids who are 3, 4 years younger how to do a keyword outline, how to use a dress-up checklist, how to follow the topic clincher rule. And the reason this works so well is because they don't have to figure it all out. They don't have to redesign the wheel. We have a well-designed wheel.
Do.
And so it's easily transferable.
Mm-hmm.
And yet in teaching something that has a system, and you don't have to figure out what to teach, you can learn a lot about the subtler aspects of teaching.
Mm-hmm.
How to manage kids, how to encourage kids who don't talk much to talk more, how to help the kids who talk too much give space to other students, reading and marking the student papers. There's a lot that is learned in that process. And then just, organizing it and being accountable and keeping everyone accountable and watching the clock, all sorts of aspects of teaching that you really can't learn except by doing it.
Sure.
And I kind of think we do teacher education in this country a little bit upside down, where someone says, I want to be a teacher, I'll go into elementary ed. And then they do, 3 years of philosophy of education, history of education, psychology, and they get all these theoretical classes before they even ever walk into a classroom and spend a few weeks. And then it's at the very end where they do their student teaching.
Mm-hmm.
And even that, I don't know, is consistently well done. I'm sure there's some places it's well done.
Mm-hmm.
If I were in charge of it all, I would probably say, you're interested in being a teacher. You can spend the first 9 months, hang out with this master teacher and just watch them every day after day after day. And don't even worry about anything except observing closely.
Mm-hmm.
All of the kids that I have encouraged to teach that I've known personally, they've been in my classes for sometimes many years.
Sure.
So, I know that they learned how by watching, observing, doing. Then they can go figure it out on their own.
Sure.
From that context, from that background. So, I have recruited kids to teach writing classes. I have taken my top Latin students and put them in charge of teaching, the next level down, generally kids that are 2 to 3, maybe 4 years younger than they are. I have encouraged teenage girls to do a book club for girls.
Mm-hmm.
And I have encouraged teenage boys to do a book club for boys. I mean, that may sound, segregationist or sexist or whatever, but I do think there's a comfort level that can happen when you have an all-girls discussion and an all-boys discussion, especially in that awkwardness where, maybe the teacher, she's 15 or 16 and there's a 12, 13-year-old boy. That could be tough. But this idea, and we have materials to help people learn to do this. In terms of literature, we've got Adam Andrews teaching the classics.
Exactly.
It's a teacher training course, how to have Socratic-style conversations. Our first debate coach when we moved to Oklahoma was my student when I was the assistant coach for our debate team in California.
Right.
And she was young, but in charge of it all.
Yep.
And so that worked out very well. And there's just any number of things. I've also heard of kids 16, 17 years old who have offered online classes to presumably mostly homeschoolers around in something they know. One example was this girl wanted to teach cooking to kids.
And she did this online?
And she did it online.
Nice.
And I thought, well, that'd be a little hard, but I guess it's possible. Like,
Sure.
Here's the ingredients you need, and I'm on the video, and you're at home in your kitchen watching me, and we can all do this together.
I love it. Yeah.
So I thought, well, that's nice. And, you may or may not put that on a transcript. I think you could figure out a way to do it.
And we have resources to direct our listeners to if you need help with your transcript. So again, link in the show notes. Speaking, of course, of Lee Benz. And her services.
The Home Scholar. Yeah. And there are lots of people who will help you figure out how to make transcripts if you need to.
Out of these unique high school classes that you're cobbling together.
Right.
Online cooking class. What does that count for?
So that's something to think about. Do you have a student who has kind of an aptness, and is there a little community that you can put together?
Sure.
And, it wouldn't necessarily be a high income thing, but I do think people should pay something.
Sure.
And if you've got several kids paying a little bit, you're probably making more per hour than if you're just, getting your first job at Chick-fil-A or whatever.
Right. Sure.
Along these lines, I am also thinking about other ways in which teenagers can interact with adults in a meaningful way.
Sure.
Rather than just being students of adults, but shared responsibilities or operating, in their world. I know I've said this on previous podcasts, but one of the things that I remember so clearly from John Taylor Gatto and his teaching and his books, Dumbing Us Down, An Underground History of American Education, he taught 8th grade English in Brooklyn, New York for 16 years.
Wow.
And he was the New York City Teacher of the Year, New York State Teacher of the Year twice, I believe. One of the things he said is what every 13-year-old in the world wants more than anything else is real, honest to God, meaningful life and death responsibility.
Well, and I do have to, mention that we do here at IEW have a couple handfuls of teenagers working for us. I won't say that they're doing life and death type work, but they're absolutely doing work that we need to have done. We're not just making things up.
And they are expected to operate as adults.
Absolutely.
And, this is why I think every kid, as soon as they're old enough to legally get a job, is excited, not just for the money, but because I'm going to test myself in the real world of adults.
Yeah, right.
And I've always had, kids working in the business, whether it was my kids or their friends or employees' kids. I've always been in favor of getting them in as soon as possible. And, it's not a fit for everyone, but I would say for the most part, probably 90% they rise to the occasion.
Absolutely.
And they learn basic stuff like show up on time and work while you're getting paid and don't chit-chat too much and keep focused and, all of these just basic life skills. But another way that I have seen families and individuals do this is to start a little business.
I love that. Yep.
And I have a talk. I haven't done it for a while, but I love doing it. It was called Freedomship and Entrepreneurship Education, I think. And, in that I talk about what you can learn from starting a little business. And if you think about our arts of language, listening, speaking, reading, writing, thinking, well, that's kind of like the absolute greatest integration because you have to be able to read and listen and acquire information, and then you have to be able to re-articulate verbally and in writing information to be able to have a product and sell it. You have to have a lot of kind of logical skills and some good basic, simple, but solid math skills to understand basic economics of cost and expense and profit and overhead. So, I've, seen various little books over the years that I have kind of referred people to in terms of, start a business with your teen,
Right.
lemonade to leadership, these ideas for that. And, I often say, if you had a little family business, you don't really even have to make much money to gain huge benefits
Yes.
from it.
Mm-hmm.
And maybe it's a virtual product. You're in the information world and you're creating something and being able to sell it or monetize it online. That's where everybody thinks, because that's where the big money may be. But, there are other entrepreneurial activities. My son had a little business we started up with him called Christoph's Sword Shop.
Yes.
And he was buying swords wholesale and selling them retail. And, he never made a lot of money, but he learned a lot of lessons.
Mm-hmm.
Another area is a service-based business. So can you be better than the average person at washing windows
Mm-hmm.
or detailing a car
Mm-hmm.
or cleaning a house or yard work or dog sitting or dog walking? Or, if you were just to do a simple web search on service business ideas, you'd get hundreds of potential things. And then maybe it's super part-time.
Yep.
Maybe it's just, you and Dad cleaning the windows of 2 or 3 buildings on a Saturday twice a month, right? That's not a huge commitment of time, but you're starting to learn all these aspects. Probably the one that I was most impressed with was, and I've met many teenage entrepreneurs, and so I've seen a lot of them, but the one I never thought about until this kid said he was doing it was maintaining fish tanks in professional offices.
Oh, I love that.
Right? So let's say you're a dentist or you're you've got some office and people come in all the time and they have a waiting room. And research shows that fish tanks help to create a calming effect.
I love that.
They have I won't say tranquilizing, that means something different, but they are emotionally relaxing.
Yeah.
Just because fish kind of float around happily. They don't worry about stuff. There's little violence going on. It's better than a screen. But if you're a professional, you don't want to have to mess with the tank. You don't want to have to figure out what to put in and keep the pH balance and clean the algae and all that. And, you've got an office, and this is enhancing your office. Well, here's, a 16-year-old kid who knows all about fish. Go in. I'll set you up with a fish tank, and I will come in every week or two, and I will be sure it's clean and operating and has good-looking fish and all that for X dollars a month.
Right.
Well, when you're in that world of being a professional, that's a no-brainer.
Mm-hmm.
That's a no-brainer. You've got margin in your
operating
accounting
budget. Yeah, sure.
To have something like that. And I almost think if a kid walked in the door and said, I'll do this for you here at the IEW office, I'd be very tempted,
Exactly.
Especially if it was, reasonable.
Mm-hmm.
So that was the one that kind of impressed me. And I guess this kid did quite well with it. He was making thousands of dollars a month.
Right.
Which when you're 16, that's pretty good.
Yep, that's pretty good. That'll fund your college experience.
Entrepreneurial ideas. And then, to finish up, I have heard lots of stories of kids who have found different ways to essentially be an adult at a younger age by operating in the world where mostly it's adults.
Sure.
One area I think is particularly accessible is to volunteer on a political campaign.
Right, sure.
Because you're not under, labor laws. You may find that there's a candidate that you can really believe in, whose positions, whose ideals, whose vision aligns very much with the world you'd like to see. And you can then, whether it's working in the office there on the phones or door to door or sending emails. I met one girl in Texas. She was 16. She had volunteered for, it was a state legislator from her zone. I don't remember exactly how Texas legislature is set up, but it was a state lawmaker. And she got on his campaign and he won. And he liked her so much. She was such a good communicator. She had done our writing program for many years.
I was wondering.
He actually put her in charge of writing his monthly or weekly or however, his regular newsletter to constituents.
Oh, I love that.
She became the editor of his communication to his constituents. And then she was getting paid.
Yep.
So the campaign was the volunteer, but she stood out because of her skills.
Yep.
And so at 16, 17 years old, she's got a job working for a state legislator in Texas doing communications for him.
Yep.
And she never went to college to get her communications or political science, right? I mean, she was right in there. Now, maybe she would go and continue her education, but what a phenomenal experience.
Yes.
At that age.
Yep.
So, a political campaign, I think, is a very reasonable way for kids to get involved. And it's a totally adult world, right? I mean, you do what you say and you say what you do and you hold yourself accountable and other people hold you accountable. And then you get the thrill, of the election and maybe winning or maybe not. And you learn something both ways.
Yep.
Kind of alongside that would be internships. That's a little bit harder, I think, to find. But at the same time, if you had a 16-year-old kid who was super interested in something like veterinary medicine and you came in and said, I'd like to work for free in this office for 6 months and learn as much as I can about what you do. I mean, it'd be pretty hard for someone to say, no, thank you. I mean, I suppose they could. But first of all, if you were the vet in charge of the office, you'd be kind of delighted, right? And you'd say, well, this is the right approach. And to work for free shows a level of interest and commitment that is beyond, I need a job.
Sure.
So internships, other kind of volunteer opportunities. And I will throw in this thought because it touches back on what we mentioned in terms of what if you did a year or two of college before you finished your high school age?
Right.
You'd kind of schedule-wise be ahead of most of your peers.
Sure.
And that might give you some time to do something you might not otherwise do.
Right.
A gap year.
I love that. Yes.
And what could you do with that? Well, travel, go on a missions trip if you're so inclined, do one of these other things, get really involved in a volunteer operation.
Right.
If your parents are willing to keep feeding you and letting you stay at home. So there'd be a freedom to experience kind of real life in a much deeper, more meaningful way than I think most kids get working part-time or during the summer in high school and then going straight off and doing 4 years of college when they're 18 to 22.
Yep.
So you could buy yourself a little time by hacking high school.
Yes.
And with that, accelerate the process of gaining experience and maturity to be successful in an adult world. And honestly, I think that right there is probably the thing that would make most teenagers the most happy because what do they want? What do we all want? So what did I hear Jordan Peterson say just last night? Satisfaction in life is gained by taking on greater levels of responsibility.
Yes.
You have 3 kids. That's a lot of responsibility, right? It's not going to be easy, but it's a lot of responsibility and you will gain satisfaction from that. So I think we need to rethink high school and kind of go back and have a much higher expectation of what high school students are capable of in terms of growing up and operating in the adult world to some degree.
I have nothing to add to that.
That was fun. I hope it helps somebody out there. Hey, write to us and let us know if you've done any of these things or if this has sparked a new idea that maybe I didn't have, because I'm constantly interested to know what do our listeners think about the things we just sit here and mouth off about.
Thank you, Andrew.
Thank you.
Thanks so much for joining us. If you enjoyed this episode and want to hear more, please subscribe to our podcast in iTunes, Google Podcasts, Stitcher, or Spotify, or just visit us each week at iew.com/podcasts. Here you can also find show notes and relevant links from today's broadcast. One last thing, would you mind going to iTunes to rate and review our podcast? This really helps other smart, caring listeners like you find us. Thanks so much.